Well, welcome everybody to Question of the Week. This is a Facebook Live session where I take on your science faith questions. This week's question comes from my friend Paul Frank, who on two separate occasions asked me to offer my thoughts on evolutionary creationism from a scientific and a biblical perspective. And we're going to do that very thing. This is actually a timely question because last week I was part of a two-day forum at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. The forum was entitled Genesis and Evolution, and I was part of a six-person panel that presented differing perspectives on science and the Christian faith. There were two scholars representing the young earth creationist view, two scholars representing the old earth creationist view, and two scholars representing theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism. The two young earth scholars were Hugh Owen, who is the director of the Colby Center. It's a Catholic institution that promotes young earth creationism. Also, Dr. Thomas Seiler, a physicist from Munich, Germany, represented young earth creationism. Yours truly was offering a scientific perspective on old earth creationism, and I was joined by Dr. Ken Keithley, who's at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, who offered a biblical perspective on an old earth creationist standpoint. And then finally, biologist Ken Miller from Brown University offered a scientific perspective on theistic evolution, and Dennis Lamoureux, a scientist from Canada, offered a biblical and scientific perspective also on theistic evolution. And so the forum again spanned 2 days. The first day was devoted to scientific issues. The second day was devoted to theological issues. And each of us had 30 minutes to present our perspective, and then we had 7 minutes to respond to each of the other perspectives. So it was a wonderful opportunity to be part of a rather prestigious panel to discuss a very important issue. It was also interesting that both Protestant and Catholic scholars were brought together to discuss and to debate and to dialogue on these issues. Some of the conversations that happened outside of the event over dinner were absolutely fascinating. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me to describe to people from a scientific perspective what old earth creationism is all about, and to offer some rationale for why I hold that particular viewpoint. So again, this question from Paul Frank is a timely question because I was just involved in this very type of dialogue again last week. Hopefully these sessions will be made available on YouTube or some other website. I know that they were recorded, but I don't know exactly what the plans are for, again, those recordings. So I'll keep you abreast when I do know where the recordings can be found for those of you who might be interested in seeing the back and forth that went on over the course of the last of 2 days last week. If you are watching this broadcast and you want to check in, please go ahead and do so in the comment section. Let us know where you're from. Say hi. Please react to this broadcast. I would love for you to do that. And then finally, if you want to offer your perspective on evolutionary creationism, please go ahead and do so in the comment section. Whether you agree or disagree with me, your perspective will be welcome. Well, Paul, great question that you asked, but it's actually a very complex and expansive topic to discuss evolutionary creationism. And I don't think that I'm going to be able to do an effective job in about 20 minutes. And so what I'm going to do today is just simply offer you kind of some big picture comments as to why I am not an evolutionary creationist and why I hold to an old earth creationist position. So that's what I'm going to do in this broadcast. If you are interested, Paul, or any others of you that are watching this broadcast are interested in exploring more specific aspects of evolutionary creationism, go ahead and list those topics in the comment section, and maybe we will do broadcasts where we'll devote our attention to specific facets of evolutionary creationism. But for now, what we're going to do again is just offer a big picture commentary. Again, with the emphasis not being on so much critiquing evolutionary creationism, because I hold to an old earth creationist perspective. I am not comfortable with evolutionary creationism, but instead of critiquing that view, what I'd rather do is explain why I hold an old earth creationist perspective, and again, why I'm not an evolutionary creationist. And I think maybe the best way to tackle this is to tell you my story, my journey not only to faith in Christ, but my journey as I began to sort out what particular perspective I was going to embrace as a Christian with regard to the way in which science interfaces with the Christian faith. And the story begins really when I was an undergraduate student. By the time I graduated high school, I was an agnostic. I didn't know if God existed or not, and honestly, that question was not even on my radar screen. I was interested in doing the best job I could to prepare myself to go to graduate school to earn a PhD in biochemistry. So I took courses in chemistry and physics and biology as an undergraduate student at West Virginia State College, now West Virginia State University. And the professors I had, who I deeply admired, taught me that life's origin, life's history, life's diversity, life's design could be explained through an outworking of evolutionary processes. I embraced those perspectives and was very comfortable holding those viewpoints. This was the early 1980s, and at that time in Arkansas there was the Brown versus the Board of Education trial that was going on, where young earth creationists were trying to introduce young earth creationism into the science curriculum. And as a backlash, my biology professors, because this was West Virginia, this was part of the Bible Belt, were concerned that young earth creationism would infiltrate high school education, high school curriculum in West Virginia, and some of the biology faculty members became advocates for teaching biological evolution. And so I was in an environment where my professors were, in effect, offering from time to time critiques of young earth creationism. And I really had no concept of what young earth creationism was really about. I viewed it as simply being an anti-evolutionary view, and of course at that time I thought evolution was the way to explain again the origin and the history of life. And so I had a rather negative perspective at that juncture on young earth creationism. But I did have a friend named David who I believe this is true. His father was a Baptist minister, and David was a creationist. I believe he was a young earth creationist. And I liked David. He was a really good guy. And he and I would have conversations, an agnostic who was completely oblivious about any kind of science faith issues, and a young earth creationist. And I remember having a conversation with David about Genesis 1. And as I looked at Genesis 1 for the first time as a young man, I was astounded at the correspondence between the Genesis 1 creation account and the history of the earth and the history of life on earth. I found that absolutely fascinating, but I can even remember then asking David, well, why couldn't day be a period of time? Why does it have to be 24 hours? I have no idea where that insight came from to this day. But the net effect is I walked away from that interaction being impressed with Genesis 1. I then went off to graduate school a few years later to earn a PhD in biochemistry. And as many of you know, if you're familiar with my story, I was profoundly impacted by the complexity, the elegance, the sophistication, and the ingenuity of the cell's chemical systems. And that, along with the inability of chemical evolution to account, in my mind, for the origin of life and hence the origin of biochemical systems, convinced me that there had to be a creator. So I moved from a position of agnosticism to essentially theism as a result of, again, what I recognized to be design in biochemical systems. And it was about 6 months later that I converted to Christianity. I'm not going to get into the details of that conversion, but I was convinced that the gospel was true. And I was able to respond to the gospel because I was convinced that a creator existed. When I was an undergraduate student, I had friends who were Christians who shared their faith with me, but that fell on deaf ears because, again, I wasn't sure if God existed, and I didn't really have an appropriate context, I think, to really apprehend the gospel. But once I became convinced that there was a creator, I was curious as to who is this creator, how do I relate to that creator, and that opened me up to really being capable of hearing the gospel and responding to the gospel. So at that point in time, I was convinced that God had to intervene to bring about the origin of life, but I was also convinced that once life's origin happened, that evolution was the way in which God would have created. I adopted a position of theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism, though I don't think that I would necessarily have even known at that time that those labels actually existed. And so skeptical about origin of life being the outworking of evolutionary processes, I saw design in biochemistry, but I just assumed that God, again, employed evolution to bring about his creative purposes. And so as I looked at Genesis 1, again, I was reminded of my conversation with David and the correspondence between the Genesis 1 and the scientific record. I just read Genesis 1 in an evolutionary mindset. And I would have argued that Adam and Eve were real individuals, but that God breathed the image of God when he breathed the breath of life into Adam, that God instituted into a hominid of some sort the image of God. And that's how I viewed, again, the relationship between Genesis 1 and the scientific record. And interestingly enough, though many evolutionary creationists actually reject what's called concordism, which is an approach that I hold to the Genesis 1 creation account, I do meet occasionally evolutionary creationists who are concordists, and so I would find compatibility with their view and my view in that sense. So anyway, about 6 years later, and I'm not going to get into the details, I was prompted to really begin to ask deeper questions about how Genesis 1 really fits, again, with the scientific record. And what prompted me to do this was essentially exposure to the first time to young earth creationist literature. My wife is also a biochemist. She's technically a molecular biologist, and we were living in Cincinnati, Ohio at the time, and she was teaching a course at Raymond Walters Community College. This would have been the early 1990s, and when it came to the section on evolution, she asked her department chairman if she could have her students write a paper on evolution versus creationism, and he thought that would be a fun project for them to do. So my wife went to the local Christian bookstore and bought up everything on the shelves involving young earth creationism and made them available to her students. After the class, she brought them home, and I can remember picking them up and flipping through them and becoming actually really concerned about what I saw to be egregious scientific errors in the young earth creationist literature. And it was at that point I really became interested in how does it all really fit together. I wanted to have a really tight understanding of the way in which science and scripture fit together. I wasn't satisfied with kind of the generalities that I had settled upon up to that point in my Christian walk. And I began to read everything I could from differing perspectives, and I was actually deeply impacted by a book that I found in a used bookstore by Michael Denton called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. I remember reading Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, Stuart Kaufman, and these are three authors that are, again, sympathetic to the evolutionary paradigm, but were challenging the standard evolutionary account. As a result of that, it really got me thinking about how secure is really the evidence for biological evolution. Is what I learned in my classes really as secure as I had been led to believe? Because it was fascinating to me that Michael Denton, an agnostic, was arguing for an archetypical approach to biology, rejecting Darwinism. That Stuart Kaufman was arguing that you needed something like complexity theory to explain the origin of life and to explain the origin of life's major groups. That while he argued that natural selection and sexual selection and genetic drift might be able to explain microevolution and speciation, there was something that was missing, and that maybe complexity theory could provide that missing information. And of course, you had Gould and Eldridge arguing that the fossil record doesn't show gradualism, but shows essentially explosive appearance of major groups followed by vast periods of stasis. And so for the first time, I began to wonder whether or not the scientific case for evolution was as secure as, again, I thought it was. I was also growing in my understanding of Christian theology and my understanding of what the biblical text said and my capacity to interpret the biblical text. And I walked away from that exercise recognizing that there had to be a historical Adam and Eve from which all humanity originates. I also understood at that time that they had to be the sole progenitors of humanity, and that evolutionary creationism didn't seem, or at that time theistic evolution, didn't seem to be really fully satisfying and fully compatible with the biblical text. And so now I'm on a journey to try to make sense of things. And it was through this process I came across a book called Creator and the Cosmos by Hugh Ross, and also other works by Hugh, A Fingerprint of God, not a matter of days, but Creation and Time was the title of the book. And I was exposed to the first time to old earth creationism, the idea that the beginning of the universe, the design of the universe pointed to the existence of a creator, that the days could be a period of time, that it was a biblically robust position. But yet Hugh, like Gould and Eldridge, like Stuart Kaufman, like Michael Denton, expressed skepticism about the evolutionary paradigm. And that, again, was intriguing to me. And so I stepped back and I asked myself, what would life look like if indeed a creator intervened throughout Earth's history to bring about his creative purposes? It would look as if there would be sudden appearances in the history of life, where there wouldn't be transitional forms preceding those explosive appearances of new forms, that stasis would be in order. And so to me, the fossil record looked like I would expect it to look if a creator was involved. And again, with Michael Denton's ideas of archetypical biology, I recognized that homologies, that shared biological features, didn't necessarily reflect common descent, but could actually be understood as reflecting common design and an archetypical approach to biology, where there are archetypical designs that existed in the mind of a creator. And so it's essentially on two reasons why I would have at that point rejected theistic evolution and embraced old earth creationism. It was because I thought the biblical text really demanded that position, and I still do today, but it was also that the features that many people pointed to as being compelling evidence for evolution could be understood from a creation model vantage point. And so today, my apologetic is basically, first and foremost, informed by, I think, the failure of the origin of life to account for the emergence of the very first life forms. I think you really do need divine input at the origin of life. And I also will note that, like the eukaryotic Big Bang, the Cambrian explosion, the radiation events that we see in vertebrate history really, I think, defy an evolutionary explanation, as does the sociocultural Big Bang and the origin of consciousness. All that to say is that there are events in life's history that I don't think the evolutionary paradigm can fully explain. And so I am basically not an evolutionary creationist because of, again, my concern about the historicity of Adam and Eve and the fact that they are the sole progenitors of all humanity. I know that there are evolutionary creationists who would argue that Adam and Eve were historical, but they were representatives, that there was a population, but I still struggle to make sense of how that would work with what the biblical text says, and how that view would work with regard to ideas like the image of God, the fall, how the fall impacts all of humanity, what is original sin, how does original sin get propagated. So these are theological issues I don't think that you can address effectively, viewing Adam and Eve as being historical but representatives, part of a larger population. And so, again, I am an old earth creationist because of biblical concerns, but also because I do see deficiency in evolutionary theory, and because I think many of the evidences that people point to as evidence for biological evolution can be accommodated in a creation model perspective. Now, one of the things that we were asked to do at this forum that I was part of in Birmingham, Alabama at Samford University was to answer the question, what would it take for you to change your position? Well, my response was, I have changed my position over the course of the last several decades. I went from being an agnostic to being a theist to being an evolutionary creationist, or to being a Christian who was an evolutionary creationist, though that term didn't exist in those days, to being an old earth creationist. And what compelled me to change my mind was essentially understanding what the biblical text was teaching, but also looking at what the scientific evidence seemed to indicate, and having a willingness to be skeptical of claims coming from biologists about the validity of the evolutionary paradigm, and also being willing to reject, or at least to be skeptical about, methodological naturalism as being a philosophical framework that is adequate, I think, for the functioning of science. I adopt something that would be known as soft methodological naturalism or theistic science, as opposed to methodological naturalism. And so, if I am convinced biblically that Adam and Eve could be mythical constructs, or if I'm convinced that they could be representatives, part of a population, then I would be much more open to evolutionary creationism. But I would also like to see scientific explanations that are clear and compelling for the origin of life, for the origin of eukaryotic organisms, for the Cambrian explosion and the origin of body plans, for the sociocultural Big Bang. In absence of evidence for those, I'm not really all that motivated to embrace evolutionary creationism. And so the long and the short of it is, I think evolutionary creationism is an interesting idea. I held that perspective for a period of time in my Christian journey. I just today don't find it to be compelling for a number of reasons. But I do respect people who do hold that perspective. And I will say this, I've had a chance to interact with many people that are part of the leadership at BioLogos. I've gotten to interact through Facebook and other outlets with evolutionary creationists. And there are evolutionary creationists who have a view that would be very close to my view. There are evolutionary creationists who would argue that Genesis 1 is historical, that they would embrace some form of concordism. I'm very comfortable with that perspective. That there are evolutionary creationists that would argue that even though there was a population of humans, that there was a historical Adam and Eve that were representatives, and that God is orchestrating the evolutionary history, that God is intervening continuously to bring about his creative purposes through this evolutionary process. Those are positions that are very close to my position, and so I'm comfortable with people that hold that viewpoint. And I do acknowledge that people that do hold that viewpoint, I think, sincerely wrestle with how do you make sense of some of the theological conundrums that arise by having Adam and Eve as being representatives yet part of a population. And so as long as people are wrestling with those issues, I think it's very easy for me to have fellowship and to look for ways in which we can actually work together to communicate that science actually supports a Christian worldview. It doesn't undermine a Christian worldview. I'm less comfortable with evolutionary creationist positions that would see God as winding up a clock and just letting it rip, which is what Ken Miller's position actually is, or a position that would argue that God front-loaded the creation so that it would unfurl in a way that he intended. I'm a little less comfortable with those positions. I'm also not comfortable with a position that would view Adam and Eve as being mythical, as being theological constructs, or a view that would reject the historicity of Genesis 1, arguing that it's essentially ancient Near Eastern creation mythology. Because I think those views really are views that, to me, unwittingly, I think undermine, how to say this gently, undermine the credibility of the Christian faith, undermine key tenets that I think are very important parts of the Christian faith. But again, I know people who hold those views, and I respect them very much and would be willing to enter into fellowship with them. So anyway, that's kind of some broad comments on evolutionary creationism and why I hold the view that I hold and why I'm not an evolutionary creationist. And I'm sure that there are many of you that want to weigh in on this topic, and I would really encourage you to go ahead and do that. I'm sure many of you disagree with my perspective or think that you might have solutions to some of the problems that I have identified. So please go ahead and offer your commentary in the comment section of this broadcast. Also, if you want to suggest future topics that relate to evolutionary creationism where we can focus on specific issues, please go ahead and list those topics in the comment section, or you can private message me or post them directly to my Facebook page. Also, if you would like to ask questions for consideration in future episodes of Question of the Week that have nothing to do whatsoever with evolutionary creationism, go ahead and post those in the comments or directly to my Facebook page, or private message me with those questions. And I just want to say thank you, everybody, thank you to everybody who is interested in my work at Reasons to Believe, who engage the articles and the podcasts and the videos that I produce, who support our ministry at Reasons to Believe. We very much appreciate everything that you do on behalf of everybody at Reasons to Believe. We're grateful for your interest in what we do and for your support. And my goal is that we can work together as Christians to communicate to people that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe that science is a very powerful arena of knowledge that supports the Christian worldview, that science is not a reason to reject Christianity, but is a reason to embrace the gospel message. So anyway, without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next week on Question of the Week. God bless every one of you. Thank you so much.